Hi, I'm Anna Doty, acting co-director of the Mùtter Museum and curator of the Mùtter Museum, as well as the director of the Mùtter Research Institute. And I'd like to welcome Megan Rosenbloom to this informal chat. Megan, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Anna. Megan Rosenbloom. I'm collection strategies librarian at UCLA Library, and I'm the author of the new debut book from me, Dark Archives. It's a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin.
Wonderful. And we should also probably mention you are a FOM, friend of Mùtter. So we go back quite a few years. And that's going to be important when we talk about the origin of this book. So I think we should just dive right into it. Well, what is the Dark Archives? What's it about?
So the origin of, my experience with my knowledge of books bound in human skin, or the 50-cent phrase, anthropodermic bibliophagy, actually began at the Mùtter Museum. So I grew up in the Philadelphia area and I was a journalist, and then I was going to library school and working in a medical publishing company. And at the time, there wasn't really a way to study rare books at the library school I was going to when it was remote. So I would just try to learn about rare books however I could because I was interested in it. So I was a docent at the Rosenbach Museum, which is down the street. I know the Mùtter has a little 2-for-1 deal sometimes with the Rosenbach. And so I was doing my docent work there, and then walked over to the Mùtter and thought, I'll come by and visit again. I always love to just stop into the Mùtter because it's such a special place, and I would always notice something new every time I went there. And this time there was a glass case around the atrium on the second floor. And, there's usually little bibs and bobs of different things that change over time. And this time I saw some old looking books and thought, oh, cool. I like books. What is this? And also they're kind of boring looking, but they're showed with their covers closed. Why would they be shown with their covers closed? And then I read the little caption, and it said that all these books were bound in human skin by doctors. And I literally looked around like, is anyone seeing this? It's like the colon and the FOP skeleton and everything's all around me, but I am just instantly shocked and surprised and disturbed by these very plain Jane looking brown leather books in the cases. And I thought, much like everything else that at the Mùtter, or many other things at the Mùtter, that this was just a Mùtter thing, that they only existed there, and that was it. And then I become a librarian. I moved to California. I take a cataloging class at California Rare Book School, and I mentioned these books that I had seen, and they're like, I think we have one of those. I'm like, what? And so then and later on, and we'll get into the testing later on, we tested, it turns out that it wasn't a real one, but they thought they had one. So then I was doing some research, potentially writing about something, but on a different topic. And whenever I would travel around to libraries and museums around the country, and eventually in Europe as well, I would ask, do you have any human skin books by chance, among the other questions I would ask. And I was surprised at how many places were like, yeah, I think I have one of those, or we used to think we had one, but I think it was just a rumor that the campus tour guides said they're not, real. So there was this very kind of not knowing element about these books. Like, oh yeah, someone wrote bound in human skin in this book at some point, but does anyone really believe that to be true? That sort of thing. And also a wide variety of reactions to how people felt about having them allegedly or not. And then I heard about a test that happened at Harvard. So at the Harvard Preservation Lab had they had 3 alleged human skin books in various libraries at Harvard. They tested them using a technique, proteomics technique that was pretty well established already called peptide mass fingerprinting. And they found out that 2 of them were not real human skin, they were sheep. And one of them was the real deal. And the news just kind of spread in library land, and people were intrigued, people were horrified. It was very controversial kind of thing that happened. And so I went to interview the chemist, Daniel Kirby, who had done that test. And then we started comparing notes. Well, I heard there's this one here, I heard there's that one there. And I think at that time he had already gotten, one of you had already gotten in touch with the other one. And eventually we all sort of joined forces in this interdisciplinary team called the Anthropodermic Book Project. And we've been looking for books in libraries and museums and testing them to find out for real whether they're human or some other animal.
That's great. Yes, I think I love how it like started with us at the Mùtter, and then and it kind of once again circled back, which is great because I do remember that. I remember putting them on display, and then I remember I really wanted to keep them up for a lot longer, but we had to be really careful about keeping them because we didn't have the best climate controls and stuff. So if I had my druthers, I'd have them up, but we put them back on. So I should probably mention that they are not on display right now. They're back in our, in the library collection. Fingers crossed one day, we can put them back up again.
There was a wallet, and the wallet turned out to not be real.
So yeah, I should mention, yeah, that's a good point, is that not only did we have, and the books are technically our historical medical library. They have the books. We have a really robust skin collection that is comprised of like skin samples almost. Like some of them even look like, I'm not going to pronounce it right. Is it chamois?
Chamois.
Yeah, like chamois cloth, and some of them actually have stab marks in them because they were looking at, they would kind of compare forensically at what does this do to the skin. We have some of those. We have jars of picked skin. So we're pretty well represented. And the wallet, absolutely. That was, I remember coming across the wallet in the mobile storage and going, I have trust issues. I mean, that's just kind of, that's what I love about this project and the science is that, my tendency to doubt, it's like, what's that term? Trust but verify.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I love about the Anthropodermic Book Project is that we're searching out sources, but then we're, saying, but let's add a little science to this, Can you, I mean, without going into too much science, because I know like that's really what Dan does and stuff, but for people who want to know a little bit more about the peptide mass fingerprinting, how would you explain it a little bit more?
Sure. I did want to mention, though, the chamois thing that you mentioned. There are a few books that we found that have tested the verified to be true that are basically human skin suede. So similar kind of thing where it's either the backside of leather or a split leather, but in this case, probably the backside has that suede feel. Those are the ones that kind of squick me out more than the regular human skin bindings. And there is sometimes in rare book land, they call that an ooze binding, OOZE.
You can't just leave me hanging, and you can't just evoke the ooze and not give me a little bit of backstory onto why.
Yeah, I've got the secret of the ooze, I guess. It's really just the same reason that you would just bind wanted a different look. Actually, the book at the Boston Athenaeum, which is very special because it's the only book that we know of that was confirmed human that actually contains the perspective and narrative of a person whose skin was bound in a book and who actually wanted that for themselves. That's an ooze binding. That's a suede binding. People tend not to want to bind books in suede because it comes with a lot of conservation issues. It tends to not hold together as well. Yeah, there's a Dance of Death at Hay Library at Brown University that is ooze, human skin ooze.
and I guess it just has to do with how the skin is processed after, after it's removed from the body. I never, literally just until now, I've never really stopped and thought, how do they make leather versus how do they make suede? It's not like they have a suede cow and a leather cow. It's the same skin, but it's a process that's different.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it's just the other side. So on the you sometimes you'll see on medieval manuscripts on parchment where you can tell that one side had hair growing out of it and the other side didn't. It's like similar.
Okay.
Yeah, as far as I can tell that.
I just feel like ashamed a little bit that literally this is the first thinking about like, huh, that's fascinating. I so cool. So let's talk a little bit about, the deeper dive into this. When we're talking about, we're using the term anthropodermic books, but they're more than just books because they are books that are made using human remains. So what there's so many questions I could ask, but I think one of them is interesting is how do libraries, special collections, museums, how do they compartmentalize? Is it always just a book? Is it a special collections book? Is it ever been cataloged where it's not just a book? I'm just curious, like, because of the nature of the binding, is it othered or not? Is it treated differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that if it's in a library, it's in a special collections area of a library. If it's in a museum, it gets a little different. Um, you know, and there are some kind of interesting differences in the law in the UK where they consider, because of the Human Tissue Act, they get very specific around what is a human remain, whereas in the United States we do not get very specific about what is a human remain versus, you know, some other some other thing, like, is this a book or is it a human remain? They're way more explicit in the UK, and also even more so and stricter in Scotland, where they'll say things like, if it is something, as far as I can tell, the distinction was like, if it's something that could regrow on a living body, like fingernails or hair, then that's not really human remains. But if it's something that would not normally grow back, like skin or blood, there seems to be a distinction there about that. There is also this idea of the application of skill, where when something is made from, if it's just a body, like a corpse that not much has been done to, it is a corpse, a human remain. If some process has been undertaken on human remain to make it into an artifact through the application of skill, then it becomes like a museum object or artifact versus, so like the Toyomoko shrunken heads are an artifact, by certain standards they would be an artifact and not a human remain, because there has been an application of skill involved, or certain tribal artifacts and stuff like that. But then I think that really it comes down to individual cases that end up, like, a lot of those Toymokos got repatriated,
Right.
because of where they're from and how they were taken. But for a long time they were trying to make arguments around it being an artifact, not a remain, because there was human skill applied to the corpse to make it into something different.
Okay.
And that would definitely be, a human skin book would fall within that, like, framework of being something different.
Although skin does regenerate, I guess even if you took it down to the dermis, past the dermis, technically, if you don't die of infection. All right, I'm getting too into the weeds into this, aren't I? I'm probably
a little bit.
I'm like, yeah, skin grafts, things like that.
Yeah, if you took enough to make to make a human skin book, I think.
Okay,
it would
fair enough.
probably
Yeah.
not grow back.
Well, okay, that's a really good question, because that's something I kind of learned indirectly through our project, that when you're looking at, for instance, like ours, it's not, when we say books bound in human skin, we weren't talking in some cases about the entire outer covering of the book. It was in some cases the spine, a little bit more. And you think, well, that's just a little bit of skin, but like when it comes to like how much skin does it, or leather, what have you, does it take to bind book, and why do you generally need more than what it looks like you end up with?
That's a good question. I mean, in the case of the three books that are Mary Lynch at the College of Physicians, they have just the spine. But if you think about it, if you unfold it, it becomes bigger. And then if you have three books, that's like kind of a lot, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I was really thinking about surface area and like how much usable area a human body has. And I think, well, let's talk. I mean, I think we have to talk a little bit about the specifics of our books too, because it's really interesting that, and I don't know, this is a question I have for you. Were there any other books that you came across where you could actually identify that, three plus books came from, one individual's skin? Like for us, there was three books that we later found out were bound in one woman's skin. And were you able to, and did that come across in any other?
No, it hasn't. And I think it's just sort of the fact that John Stockton Huff made such copious notes inside of his book allowed you to know so much more about the individual books and how they were created than most of the other human skin books we come across, because he put Mary L underlined, and then your librarian Beth Lander was able to use the hospital and the dates and the diseases to be able to identify her as Mary Lynch. It's a very unusual amount of information to get, but also that he specified that it came from the skin from around her thighs, that it was tanned in a pot de chambre, like a chamber pot, using urine. All these things were all way more details than we would normally get. Normally in human skin books, the most you get is bound in human skin, or maybe bound in the skin of a woman is like the most otherwise you would get. Sometimes a lot of the other ones that have any sort of indication about who they might be in terms of an identity or something turn out to be totally fake anyway. And then there's the interesting cases in England and Scotland where which we haven't tested those yet. So, they haven't been part of the project yet, but they're very interesting and they're covered in my book, the stories around them. But they're really strange because they're specifically punitive, that they're trying to punish murderers by doing lots of things with their remains, including public dissection, phrenological study, death masks, articulating the skeleton for use in hospitals and things, and also taking a portion of their skin and binding their trial transcript in their skin. So because there are all these other artifacts made from these bodies, it inclines me to believe that these are probably genuine, but we haven't actually tested those yet. And so the strange part about those is that we know exactly who they are. And we know things about, if they're proven to be real, we know exactly who they are. And but we also know about them because of the trial transcript of the crime that they went down for. So we get a perspective of the things that happened in your life, but it's a very specific perspective. And it's certainly not like the book at the Boston Athenaeum where it's coming from them.
A great thing to address is like the reasons. There's not just one reason why books could be bound in human skin, like you mentioned, as maybe like a punitive or sometimes cautionary tale, like hey, and I think wasn't one of them that I think maybe turned out to be not be the highwayman. So this was the book bound in the skin of a highwayman. Like if you do that, if you engage in these criminal activities, this could be your skin in another book. I think one of the really interesting ones is, I don't know if they made a book out of him, but the infamous Burke and Hare.
Yes. So the highwayman is actually the guy at the Boston Athenaeum. So he's the real deal. He gets a whole chapter in my book because I find him fascinating. First of all, I get to hear from one of these people in their own words, which is just invaluable. The entire book is actually digitized online because it's human suede. It's a little like rough to handle. People always want to see it, so they digitized the whole thing online so that people could read the story and look at the book without actually physically touching it. It's a conservation issue.
That's smart.
So yeah, so that is, I call him George Walton in the book, but he has many aliases. Some are quite excellent, like Burley Grove. I just love that name. It's just such a good one. But he's like, to hear it from his own perspective, if someone would have helped him when he was a kid and an orphan and needed help, the first time he got locked up, he was so horrified he would have never gone back to jail. But then, no one helped him and he needed to like live. So he kept, robbing people. And he also had he loved to break out of prison in spectacular ways, to the point where it seemed like everyone kind of loved him and thought like, oh, he broke out again, this sort of thing, where he seemed to be well liked, or at least from his perspective.
Why is there a movie made about him?
Oh, he definitely deserves it.
He definitely needs the Hollywood treatment. If anybody's listening to this, let's get on that.
Right. My favorite story of his is that after he had broken out again at the Massachusetts State Prison, they put him into a cell by himself in like a disused area of the prison that was up high. There's this very big cell, and they put him in the middle of the room and had a ring kind of bolt in the floor with it around his foot. And so they're like, you're going to stay put this time. And then he's like, okay, well, you got me. And then every day when they would leave, like check his foot to make sure it was okay, the ring was too big, so he would just slip his foot out, and then he'd like be doing exercise, hanging out. He would at night, he would just like stare out. He had this high view with a window, like this like penthouse suite practically in the prison, where he would just like gaze out in the night sky. And then when the guards came back in the morning, he slipped his foot back in and just pretend, oh yeah, I'm just stuck here, boy. So that was kind of fascinating. And then the Burke and Hare books, again, we have not tested that book yet. I really hope we do get to at some point. But that one was even more interesting to me in terms of that punitive element, because it wasn't just that he murdered somebody, and because you could get executed very easily in the UK. You could get executed for, robbery and things like that. So when you actually committed a heinous murder, they wanted to really make a show out of your punishment. And that's why a lot of these things happened. And also
the betrayal factor though, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Turning evidence against. I guess we should probably give a 5-second, like so Burke and Hare were considered, they weren't body snatchers. They didn't rob graves. They actually decided to cut out that whole death part and provide fresh bodies by killing people in the boarding house of it. Was it Burke's boarding house or Hare's boarding house?
Hare's, yeah.
Hare's boarding house. And they killed like upwards of more than 10 people before they were finally caught.
Yeah, I want to say it was like 14.
It was a lot. Patrick Stewart back when he had hair was in a movie about Burke and Hare. But there's been books written about it, so they're pretty infamous.
So what they did was they were trying. So the way it started was, they were poor laborers who were living in Edinburgh, which was like the total seat of medical education at the time. And there was this huge need, this demand for dead bodies to dissect, to teach all these medical students. And the supply was not available because of the law. So it was actually quite rampant and tacitly condoned for medical students to expect to go dig up fresh graves in order to get bodies to do their studies. And that was one of the first things I learned about the history of medicine that got me interested in it, because I was like, what? How is this okay? That it was so the way it didn't jibe with the way we think about doctors and their standing in the world to
Right.
hear this part of their history. So then, you know, there were people digging up bodies, whatever. They cut out the middle man who wants a shovel and a dusty body when you could have a freshly dead one if you murder someone. The first one was an accident because someone was staying with them and died by accident, and they thought, oh, we're gonna have to pay all this money to bury this old guy that just died on us in this boarding house. And then they were like, actually, if we take them down to the surgeons, to Surgeon Square, maybe we can get some money for him. And they got a lot of money, like the
Fresh.
equivalent.
They would pay,
Yeah.
the fresher, the more money.
Yeah. And they got the equivalent of like what would have been 100 days work. And then they thought, and then, you know, they started doing this thing where they would get lodgers drunk, and then they perfected this sort of method that didn't show a lot of trauma on the body, where they would basically, they start like a pillow, they tried with a pillow, didn't really work, that they would hold over someone's nose and mouth and like put their weight down on someone until they stopped breathing, and that was called Burking. That's named after William Burke. So yeah, William Hare was his partner, but turned King's evidence, as they called it, on him in order to get out of getting executed. So then William Burke's body was taken, and all those things happened. I mean, there are some notes in the anatomical museums in Edinburgh that are like, this is a note written in the blood from the head of the murderer William Burke. I mean, people really.
Is this getting a little Shroud of Turin? Like if you actually added up all of the things that people said were from Burke, it'd be a lot more than he could actually possibly be from his body? Or
See, that's sort of the little questiony doubter in the back of my mind, was that I heard that there is another alleged book of some kind in private hands in Edinburgh that I would like to learn more about. There were a lot of kind of souvenirs, murderabilia kind of things that came out around these times with these like sort of famous murders, where it's like, there was another murder featured in my book is called the Red Barn Murder, and they would have, you know, snuff shoes like shaped like the red barn that were from the barn, from the wood from the barn, and things like that, where you're like, little not sure. So I would love to, that's like definitely, the Burke book is really high up on my list in terms of testing it to see if it's real, because you never know, like, when did the book actually get made, by whom, and how did it get into the museum? It can be a lot harder to trace those things than you think.
we didn't mention that the time elapsed between when Mary died and when the books were bound in her skin. And I think that's important to note too. Like, I mean, provenance obviously is so important, right? But like, you have to take a look at it too. Like, you can have human skin that is turned into leather, suede, what have you, and then it is effectively shelf stable. And in Mary's case, maybe you want to tell the story a little bit about the timeline, roughly, of the timeline that went through. And like, I find that fascinating because I think it kind of gives us a little peek into the life of our dear doctor too, to say what was going on there.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about John Stockton Huff was that he was really into making lots of detailed notes. So that's the reason why I used the Mary Lynch books as the sort of basis for then going to a historical leather tannery and trying to sort of reverse engineer what someone might have done in order to make these books. Like, how physically would one have made it? There exists, leather tanning was a trade. And so there were a lot of different ways to make leather or leather-like things.
You did mention pee, and I think you need to kind of address that because people were just like, "Excuse me, what?"
Yes. So, so when I went to the leather tannery, I was talking to Jesse Meyer at Pergamena, one of the few places that still does leather tanning the old-fashioned way, because now they use chrome. The chemicals are very environmentally impactful, and highly regulated. And usually, if there's a leather tannery, it's like a very big production. And his is sort of this family business. They've actually the Myers have been tanning leather since 1550, which
Wow.
is, yeah, it's incredible. And so he was able, and he works with a lot of historians and museums and libraries to say make parchment in a certain old way so that they can run tests on it and see like what the tear strength is and blah blah blah. And so he is really a process geek, right? He knows a lot about how these things were done in the past, what differences are today, and is able to give modern researchers and people who preserve objects like a lot more information than they would be able to get by just say reading in a book, because a lot of that information was passed down word of mouth as trade. So I tried to get him to help me out, like, okay, how would this work with the urine? What's up with the urine? And so it's like, at first, urine is acidic, and it would stop the process. It would stop the decay process briefly.
Briefly, okay.
But then it would turn into, then it gets, old urine actually has its own name, which I found in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's called lant, Lant. And then it's like, it gets stronger and then it turns into a base.
Interesting.
And so that can help for a little while, and it can also help like get like dehair and stuff like that. But you have to get the pH back. So making leather from skin has a lot to do with continually changing from acid to base and then regulating it so that it doesn't actually fall apart. Like you have to, you take it this way to have this effect, you take it that way to have another effect.
Wow.
And then you keep like doing things to it into the point where it becomes stable. That's why it's so much more intense than making parchment, because parchment, although like you scrape it, you dry it, you scrape it off, you scrape the hair off and all the viscera and things like that, but ultimately it's still kind of like, it's not shelf stable for real. So even though there are books that are made of parchment, if it gets too hot, it does that wavy thing, it expands, it contracts, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't really happen with leather that much. But it's all these like really pretty, like harsh chemical processes.
And that's important because we have to talk about science, and like, nowadays everybody's talking DNA, DNA, DNA. But you're talking a lot about these harsh chemicals and time and acid and base. I can see that being very harmful to any residual DNA that might be there. So let's talk a little bit about DNA versus peptide mass fingerprinting, and also like the limitations. Like what is mass peptide fingerprinting? What can it tell you exactly, and what can it not tell you?
Sure. So yeah, everyone would love to be able to get DNA from these books, right? However, for the most part, with current methods, which are changing all the time, you well know that there are amazing advances going on in ancient DNA. However, the leather tanning process in particular, like a lot of those great advances and tests that are being done where you can explore parchment not only at DNA genomic but also microgenome like those things, is because that parchment is still sort of pure in a certain way that a leather would not be, because of all the processes. So the older DNA gets harder to access, the older the object gets, unless it happens to be preserved in a really special way. Like some of Otzi, I think the Iceman had some DNA still left because he was frozen in a certain way. There's certain, you can get lucky sometimes depending on the preservation method.
Or like like mummies, like the mummification, dehydration. It usually extremes, because if a body preserves, or parts of a body preserve throughout that time, chances are there's some DNA. But yeah, I think that's a good point to make, is that it's not just time with these books, it's time and immense in human intervention.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a lot that happens to it that hastens the degradation of a DNA. Now, what we test, the method that we use on the Anthropodermic Book Project is called Peptide Mass Fingerprinting, or PMF. And the way it works is that it's kind of so straightforward, where you just take a teeny, super tiny piece of the binding, and you digest it in this enzyme called trypsin, and then you run it through a mass spectrometer. And what it does is that it finds the collagen protein in the sample, and then matches the spectrometry, like the wave, the line graph kind of looking thing that you get back, with a known database of animal things. So you see, oh, it's this shape, it's a human, it's that shape, it's a sheep. And how specific you can get, at the moment, has to do with, the available samples, but also how far back in evolutionary time did the animals branch off from each other. So when it comes to the Bovidae family, you've got most of your animals for leather, right? You've got your cows and your sheep and your goats. They're all the same animal family, but they split off apart from each other so far back that it's a lot easier to tell because they have a lot more differences. Whereas with a human sample, it's a Hominidae. I think I got that. I'm not that good at saying that one, but it's the great ape family. So presumably, although I've never seen an alleged gorilla or chimpanzee bound book, if anyone finds one, please let me know because I'm very curious. Presumably they would be indistinguishable from human skin-bound book.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Right. But you can, provenance plus the test, it's like, okay, this is not a sheep. This is a great ape. It's a human because of the provenance plus the science. So that's sort of the way that we do it. Now, what could we find out if we had DNA that was reliable? Biological sex would be the main thing that we could find out. We could not find out what the, say, racial or ethnic identity of a person would be.
It can tell you so much, and yet there's still, I think that's just really interesting about, science can lead you up to a certain point, but sometimes it's, that's it. And then you have to just be like, okay, now what can I, using just, I would say like librarian gumshoeing, like detective work. And that's why it's like provenance is so important. And, I think people in the museum community, in the library community, you'll hear us just expound upon the importance of that. But I think in this case, it's a really good example of the importance of that.
Oh, absolutely. Because there's so many books that, I know that there are a lot of books that we've tested and that I've done research on that there's still big question mark areas, because if you think about all the different people who had to be involved in the creation of these objects, right? So there was a patient, there was, and usually of unknown origin, who was very, 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 very likely indigent. But, we have no idea where they came from, how they came to end up on the slab. You have a doctor, motivated to do this. That you have, maybe they bound it themselves, but they probably also had a binder, that did the work for them. Then you know, you've got whoever the book was for, whether it was for the doctor themselves, they gave it as a gift, as some of the things that we've seen, or then maybe there's an original owner, then it goes down the line, it gets, you know, to another collector, to an institution. The institution now has it. What am I going to do with this thing? You know, so it's just, there's so many different people involved in that process. And like, yeah, you know, I don't even think that a lot of the doctors who create these actually tanned the leather. Like from my conversation with Jesse Meyer, Pergamena, it really made me think that if John Stockton Huff actually tanned it, not just preserved it, he used the word tan, but a lot of people use the word tan when they don't really mean tan. So he may have preserved it long enough to take it to unknown person to tan, and then keep it shelf stable for decades. I want to say it was many years.
Yeah. Long
Yeah.
period of time between when the leather must have been, we know that it had to have been, like you said, preserved or in some way, shape, or form rendered stable until, and then it didn't make it onto a book until what, like 10 or 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And then wasn't that because he was getting married for the second time?
Oh,
Like
that's
around the time.
I don't know about that part. That might be
I
something
believe,
Beth knew.
yeah, I believe he was getting married. He had already been widowed once, and then he was getting married for the second time. This is pure conjecture. I mean, like we do know that he was getting married the second time, and we do know the book was bound around the time he was getting married or got married. So, you know, that leaves the question, maybe it was a situation of, you know, maybe that happens, you know, when you have a new relationship and you're going through your fiance's t-shirt drawer and you're like, you're really going to keep all these t-shirts? Come on, we're not going to have room in our new house for, but in this time's like, honey, what's this? Can you imagine that
Explain
conversation?
yourself.
Explain. I was going to use that to bind some books because, yeah, right?
Yeah, because that's normal. Yeah, so Mary Lynch was on his autopsy table in like 1869. His books were bound in the 1880s. Then
Right.
there was another one that was taken from the skin and bound like almost right away. That's the one that's in the Penn Library,
Mm-hmm.
which also is a very weird book because it's basically like a catalog of other books. And it's very big, and it looks like it's really poorly done too. And so like all of this is just things that you try to cobble together by like putting the timeline of what he put in, like what he told you in the book, because he was just a note-taking kind of guy.
He was a note, but here's the interesting thing about him. I mean, like, he wasn't Mary's primary physician. Like,
Mm-mm.
she had a primary physician, but she was in the hospital for quite some time because she had a really, well, she went in for what, tuberculosis, right? Maybe you should tell a little bit about the story of Mary's life before her life as a book. You know, she had a life before that, and it was very interesting that her medical journey kind of with the twists and turns and how Huff
Yeah.
came into it.
So this is another fun thing that I'm going to mess up saying, but so Mary Lynch is an Irish young woman, and she contracted phthisis. And so like it's really hard to say. We would now lump a number of things like phthisis and consumption and whatever under the broader under this tuberculosis umbrella, right? But
Yeah.
they were described as different things, and that's the one I can never say. But she contracted this, so she goes to the hospital at Old Blockley was the nickname of the hospital. It was not a nice place. It was in West Philadelphia, and it was like you did not go to the hospital if you were a rich person. You went to the hospital if you were poor and you needed someone to take care of you because you could not be taken care of at home. And this hospital was like, there was an asylum part of the hospital. There were all these, and it's this huge place. And so the doctors who would be training, like at the time, I want to say Huff was like 23 when Mary Lynch died, and he was a resident, basically like a medical resident, and still learning. And so with the development of clinical medicine, it's great that people went around and learned, saw a lot of patients, but the people that they saw were people in these hospitals who were poor, and they would learn a lot more, but also there's this kind of way of looking at patients that develops, which actually, the first time I heard the phrase clinical gaze, which is basically the theme of my book, I heard it from Robert Hicks at the Mùtter, and he did a talk about that at Desalon, and I was like, it kind of opened I was like, that's it. That's what I've been looking for, is like, why could somebody make these books? Like, in what situation? Well, in clinical medicine, you're getting a lot more, you're getting scientific background you never got before, you're seeing a lot more people, you're learning at the cadaver, you're learning all these things, and there's a development of these new diagnostic tools people didn't have before. So you couldn't, suddenly the doctor knows more about you than you can tell the doctor, right? And so the doctor starts, if you're seeing tons and tons of people, it's easy to lose sight of the humanity of those people and start seeing them as organs and diseases to be cured and a body on a slab that I'm dissecting. And you have to get pretty far along the depersonalization line to be like, oh, well, I'm dissecting this corpse and I'll just save a bit of skin and put it aside for later. And that is a mindset that Dr. Huff got to when he made these books. So he had, so Mary Lynch had nurses taking care of her at the hospital, and she had family coming to visit her. And at one point, the family brought her some sandwiches, and they were like bologna sandwiches, and they failed to notice that there was these little worms in the meat. And those little worms are the thing that turns out to cause trichinosis. And it was another Philadelphia doctor, Dr. Leidy, who was performing medicine at the same time and had discovered a little while before that trichinosis in pigs, if you eat that pig, you can get trichinosis in people. And so it's so weird that a city that small would have this like odd overlap. And Dr. Leidy, who we know all about in Mùtter history, also has created a human skin book that is in your collection. So it's if Dr. Leidy saw Mary Lynch about to eat that sandwich and said, no girl, there's something not right with that meat, I looked at it with my little microscope that I like to play with, that was still kind of a bit of a toy when he was playing with it, then maybe she wouldn't have gotten so sick. So it was like she had tuberculosis, was trying to recover, gets trichinosis, and then wastes away to like 70 pounds before she died.
She was.
Mm-hmm. So and she ends up on the
autopsy records too. So they actually talked about how, I mean, without getting too graphic, but there were worms just
millions
everywhere.
Yeah. And so young medical resident, Dr. Huff, is performing this autopsy on Mary and another person who I think I may have found him, but it's not as bright of a line in the archives. Inspired by Beth, I tried to find his initials and in and out dates, but his initials aren't in the book, just a description of an Irish intemperate laborer or something like that. So, Dr. Huff writes up for a journal this 2 autopsies of people who died, and then he found trichinosis in them. And this was the first that he knew of that was presenting in Philadelphia. So
was that his, did he go on to specialize in like parasitic diseases? Was that his thing, or just happened to be a really dramatic case?
He had multiple like hobby horses, I guess. I don't know, specialties, however you want to put it in those days. He was interested in parasitic trichiny, and he also was a basically like early OBGYN, male OBGYN, which is why the 3 books that he bound in Mary Lynch's Skin are all books about women's health and reproduction.
Uh-huh.
So
Interesting. Let's go on to talk about, I mean, there's just so many things. There's so many things. But I'm interested to learn a little bit more about how are you feeling about the intersection of using sciences like PMF and what it can help inform us about, history and like, I love the idea of conflating, science and history and how I think both disciplines are opening up windows into each other in a sense, so the application of them. But in terms of your journey to write this book, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
yeah, I mean, I guess I could have written a book about about anthropodermic bibliology without knowing that scientific bit and just telling the history stories that I could find. But the thing that really made me want to do it, the thing that made me think that I was contributing something that was new, was this new element of knowing something we couldn't have known before. Because of the books we've tested so far, we've got 18 that are proven to be human skin, so we know that about them. But there are 13 other books that were not, right? So they've lived their whole book life with these stories attached to them that somewhere along the line got either conflated intentionally or not intentionally. Stories tie onto things, and you either choose to believe them or you don't, until there is actually scientific fact where you can say, yes, this is definitely an example of this practice. Then you look at the real ones and say, okay, who are the people that we can find that are involved in this, and what does this tell us about what does this tell us? What does this tell us about history and the way we understand the history of medicine and clinical empathy and the importance of these things, these objects that to us are so truly horrific and kind of unimaginable in a time when we hold the idea of medical consent so dear, but that idea is so new. And it was not something that that's not a concept that people had in their minds, and who had the access to these, materials, who had the kind of desire to collect rare books and art and be a gentleman because they're a growing sort of on the up doctoring class, and who didn't have any sort of agency to do anything about it if someone they knew or loved or themselves or whatever ended up as a book. It's so, today we hear a story, oh, there's a book bound in human skin, you automatically jump to, serial killers and Nazis and all these things because you think, who are the worst monsters? And it's really hard for people to say, oh no, it's this area it's a part of the history of a group of people that we revere and that you want your kids to grow up to be someday and things like that. And it's important for everyone, but also doctors, to know this about their past. They should know and reckon with the dark things about their past. But if we didn't have the science to prove that thing, then it's sort of like, oh, it's a dismissible rumor. Oh, people say that used to happen, but people used to say a lot of things, right? And, does anyone really believe that that's that's what it says it is until you can find for sure. So
I love that idea of, have you felt has there been any conflict, any pushback from the medical community? Because this does have a really amazing tie-in. Bioethics is more than ever becoming so important to have that conversation with not just physicians, but I think everybody really could benefit from a real introspective gaze and looking at things in terms of bioethics. That's something we do at the museum. We're very aware of where the bulk of our collection comes from, and we don't try to hide it. And in many cases, I I personally like to tell those stories because if we have the provenance, that's the thing is, you're right, in so many cases it's just not even thought of to gather that information about the patient, because it wasn't about, in our case, when we're talking about specimens, when we're talking about things in jars, it wasn't about the patient as an individual. It was about, this is a great example of a lung with tuberculosis, or this is a amazing fibroid tumor. It wasn't, this is Mary's medical journey, and this is this fibroid tumor represents, is not just the fibroid tumor, but it represents this entire narrative that goes around the patient. So that's something different that we're doing now that wasn't done in the past. But I still think it's important to talk about the reasoning, why these collections were done, why were these books bound, what was the importance. I think there's just a really interesting broader conversation that can be had about bioethics, and I'm sure we could talk about that another hours and stuff. But
Sure.
let's talk a little bit. I want to get your feel on the bioethics thing, and then we can chat about some other things. But I think it's important to talk about.
Yeah, I think that I think you and I have similar perspectives on what can be done with this knowledge, right? But I would say these objects are truly controversial. They're not controversial like evolution is controversial, where it's like, teach the controversy, it's not controversial. You know what I mean? Like, there's certain things that everyone agrees on. These books are actually controversial in that people have a lot of very legitimate differing opinions about what should be done with them. And I think that that is part of what I tried to show in the book, is a diversity of opinions about these books. But I think the way that I look at them and the way that you work with collection items that may have been gotten through some ill-gotten gains of some way, is not, let's bury them in the ground, because some people want that. But okay, these objects are evidence of something that happened, that tell us something that we should know and reckon with. And so how can I change how can I use this object to tell a story about the context in which we trained medical doctors in the past? How do we do things differently now? What, why is it important? If these books were destroyed, we would never have gotten to the point where we were able to learn whether they were real, right? If they were, who knows what else you could get off of them, what else you could learn from them, in the future. Like some of those animal specimens of, in natural history museums of dried birds, and then they're using that to study climate change, or discovering from old feathers that, oh, we always thought that this bird was in this group, but actually it's a different thing. Or there were like 5 species and we thought it was all one, but when we look at, so it's all only because the artifacts persist are we able to interrogate them with new lenses and bring new ethical ideas to them and use them to teach important lessons about them. So I feel like they're really important as teaching tools. Other people maybe not. And I think especially with the human skin book and that application of skill versus some of the specimens in your collection of unusual presentations of bodies, is that human skin books were not used to teach physicians how to treat patients, that like unusual things. They were not. They were made as collector's items out of humans. That's like another level. However, I would argue they are teaching us something about, they are teaching physicians something, but we are only just really realizing what that is.
Oh, that's great. That's just goes, that has so many other questions I want to ask, but I think we're going to have to save it because we're already like so many things. But because I definitely have to ask one other thing, which was, how did you celebrate when you finished your book? Because again, of course, has a little little College of Physicians tie-in. I thought we'd tell that little story and tell us a little bit about that.
I'm happy to share about that. So the funny thing, so there's a couple funny things about it, but I will show. I hope you can see this well. Let me see if I can. It's kind of hard to make my arm do it right. Let me
I think
see.
you put your elbow down. That's good. Yes, right there. That's good.
Okay, like that.
Yes.
All right.
Oh.
So I got this tattoo. My tattoo artist's name is Calato Tattoo out of Brooklyn, but she makes sojourns to LA sometimes. So this tattoo is an amalgamation of a book plate that I saw in the College of Physicians library, which was, I believe, the bottom part, the banner, the book, and the skull. And then there's another one that's the moth. I choose to call it moth. It could be a butterfly.
Can we get an entomologist? If an entomologist is watching this, please put in the comments is that a moth or a butterfly, please?
Yeah, because I think like goth moth. It's like what I think about.
Is there such a thing as a goth moth? Like it's all black, or?
Yeah. Oh no, it's even better than that. If you look up, if you search ye old internet for a hashtag goth moth, you will see that there are moths that have like an upside down. They're black with an upside down white cross. It looks like I would say it's more like a black metal moth than a goth moth, but yeah. So I love that. So this one isn't a goth moth, but you know, it sort of has that energy. So the book was like not part. Oh, you know what it was? The original image on the book plate is goth moth, skull, and the banner. The banner says "Cassasia" in French, which means "What do I know?" It's a Montaigne quote, and the book was added and the banner was taken away, and that became the logo for the Historical Medical Library at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. So I decided to just put it all in there because I'm a bit of a maximalist. And the quote, you know, the way I choose to interpret it, not a Montaigne scholar or anything like that, was sort of about questioning and always learning, lifelong learning, sort of what do I know? But then it turned out to be kind of funny because I was working on the book and I had booked my, you know, tattoo months and months in advance. When I got the tattoo, then there was this huge delay in the book and I got the tattoo and the book wasn't done yet. So then it was sort of like, this is my book finishing tattoo, but what do I know? And the fact that I could laugh about it and that it didn't make me sad made me know that it was a good tattoo decision. So I love my tattoo. The tattoo artist, when I got it, was like, why? Are you sure you don't want it to face the other way? Like to face your arm? I was like, no, this is for me. Even though it is, as you can tell, kind of difficult to show off when I'm like trying to show it on the screen, it was for me to look at. Those tattoos for me. And it was about like to try to like encapsulate my journey of writing my first ever book. And it's like the book itself, like a love letter to the Mùtter in a certain way, right? So it's very special to me, for sure.
And maybe, who knows, it'll come full circle because I believe, I remember when you got the tattoo and I have deemed it jar worthy, you know, like it has passed my standards and while I hope it doesn't come to us for many years, just to let you know, I would take it if you offered.
Yeah, so I appreciate your curatorial assessment that it's jar worthy. And part of the book actually is that I try to, towards the end of the book, I wanted to talk more, like jump into the present and like what do these books, the buying and selling, collecting of them, or what if you wanted to create one, let's say you did, what could you? You know, the answer is not as cut and dried as you might expect. You would think that there would be laws that would say you can do this and not this. It's a lot more complicated. It depends on who you are, like where you are, I mean, like in the world. And in America, it's very complicated because there is, with the exception of NAGPRA, which is the Native American Repatriation Graves, Grave Repatriation, Act. With the exception of that, there are no federal laws that govern human remains. So usually what are permissible disposition methods is sort of on a state level, and a lot of the state laws simply say that it is that desecration of a corpse is based on community standards.
It's so gray. It's so gray.
What are community standards? For a long time, cremation would have been considered desecration of a corpse. My colleagues at the Order of the Good Death have been going around and making certain new disposition methods, green methods of like aquamation, which is the cremation with water, or recomposition, which is basically human composting, that they're going around and making certain disposition methods expressly legal because you don't want to like start a business or do a thing and then someone complains and then it's complaint-based desecration of a corpse. Do you really want to have built a whole facility and then someone cries foul about that? And then, so they're going out and, getting laws passed, but no one's going to go out and say, I want to pass this law that says it's okay to make human skin books, because the demand is not so much there, right? So, but the closest thing I could find that was comparable, I thought, were some of these new methods of post-mortem tattoo preservation. So as you know, and you have many examples of it at the Mùtter, that people have been preserving tattoos for a long time, and that there are different methods. There's like this dry crackery method, there's this wet specimen method, but there have been some newer methods where the thing you get is this very kind of pristine looking, clean piece of art that you could put in a frame, but it's actually someone's skin. And so I talked to some of the different people who have, who pioneered these methods, and I talked to them about the law, and I talked to Tanya Marsh, who's my resident corpse law expert person. I talked to her about the legalities of doing something like this, but it's very interesting because it seems as though if you say to someone, just like general people, like, what would you think about being bound into a book, like binding your book in your skin? It is very rare that someone would be like, yes, that sounds awesome. It's not that often. If you talk to
hanging around with a different demographic.
Yeah, it's really like my journalism. I had to really put on my journalism hat for that, because my friend
maybe we'll be able to put a poll in this.
Yeah, our friends are maybe a little bit more, open.
Yeah.
But then if you talk to regular people who are tattooed, they seem way more likely to be interested in preserving their tattoos. Just unscientific, poll. That people seem to be like, yeah, I spent a lot of money on these tattoos. They're super meaningful for me. They are very expressly me. Why should I let them rot in the ground? I would love for, my husband or friends or whatever to be able to like have this. So there's much more of an actual current demand. We add in the very express consent element, but the consent element does not a law make. So those two things diverge a lot, and unless someone like expressly makes something legal or illegal.
This is exactly what we're dealing with at the museum. We get people come to us all the time and say, I am getting, like, from my body, I am having something removed. Would you like it? And I was like, what state do you live in? And then we have to have the conversation of, have you talked to your doctor? There's so much more that goes into it, and it's like I have to be like the bearer of bad news to these individuals, because in many cases I would like to have it, but I have to be like, here's what we have to do to make your wish happen. And I'll tell you, it's not 100% success rate. I would say, there's been a lot that have unfortunately not happened, and it's a shame. I did recently get my first human heart from a human heart transplant patient. So it was such a wonderful story. I mean, obviously he gave consent left, right, and center, but even then, the amount of work we had to go through just to facilitate that donation, it's a shame, because I really do think, if possible, like, it should be a little bit more easier for you to either a bitter piece of you while you're still alive, or even when to make arrangements, after you pass. It shouldn't be that hard, but maybe that's something we have to, let's get working on that in our spare time.
Yeah, well, because it's really like consent, which we care deeply about, but also relatively new. And then, so we just assume that if someone consents to something, that should be okay. But the law, like, especially in America, with this sort of individualist sort of attitude, and there are all these new methods of like, have your cremated remains made into jewelry or a vinyl record or a artificial coral reef and all these things, and people are like, yeah, cool, love it, I get to pick what I want to do. And then, but the laws are over here just like, no one's paying attention to us, like, they kind of, so it's yeah, I think Tanya Marsh used a phrase I really liked, which was like, our focus on consent instead of focusing on what's expressly illegal in America is blazingly idiosyncratic when you look at the world and their laws around human remains, basically. So it's pretty fascinating. And yeah, big gray area, so who knows what'll happen when, because you may know that in certain states, one can buy and sell human remains. In other states, you cannot do that. Sometimes it depends on how old they are.
And the definition of what constitutes a human remain, like, hair generally doesn't. Things like fingernails, that kind of thing generally do not count as human remains, even though technically they are, who comes off of a human being. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. I think teeth are usually like not a human remain. I'm trying to remember exactly, but they're sort of a,
They are. I mean, because they are very much a human remain, but I guess it's like, because they're so often seen in a disassociated role. Like, so many people get teeth pulled,
baby teeth.
Yeah, and it's usually more acceptable for you to get possession of your teeth after they're extracted, as opposed to like your tonsils or your gallbladder. It's a little easier. What's really interesting, though, is the trend. I know we don't have time to talk about too much, but the placenta. When did that suddenly become from something that, if my mom had asked for her placenta, 10 years ago, it was been like, no. And now, when I went to have my baby, I didn't ask. They asked me, would you like your placenta? And would you like it like freeze-dried? I mean, I was like.
Yeah. And made into pills. It's, on a long enough arc, everything old is new again, including medical cannibalism. And I'm in mom groups on Facebook and stuff, and people generally seem to be very comfortable with the whole placentophagy. I did not do that, partially because there isn't really like concrete science that is beneficial. People swear up and down that it is, but it's sort of like how my grandmother and everyone in my family believes that if you have a fever and you put an onion on your foot, that it will draw out the fever. They all swear by it, but can you find that in a book in a scientific text that says it's true? No, it's more a folk thing. The placenta thing is also more of a folk thing. But I did donate my cord blood. I did donate my the umbilical cord, because the stem cells in the umbilical cord can be put to use. Some people hold on to them for themselves and pay money to keep it. But I donated mine because who knows if you would ever need it. And some people could really use it. And seriously, within a few days, I got a call after my kid was born that, her stem cells were used in a life-saving operation. And so to me, that was like very special. And, they were calling her a little hero and stuff. And I'm like, all like hormonal and but also feeling very good about the gift that I was able to give, and that's part of what is appealing about donating your body to science or donating my tattoo to a museum. I'm not signing anything yet.
All right. Well, I have time. I can work on you. I'm going to wear you down.
Yeah, my corpse, my choice. I'm going to take a little time and make a decision, because if I did donate my tattoo to the Mùtter, I probably couldn't donate the rest of my body to a med school because they don't take missing parts.
That's a good, you know what? That is a good point. That's a good point. And hopefully, because that's actually something people already asked me, like, obviously you're donating your body to the museum, right? And I said, no, I'm actually beyond an organ donor. I'm an organ tissue researcher donor. So ideally, there's going to be very, very, I would hope, little left of me when all is said and done. So there's not going to be anything of interest left, one would hope. I'm like, you just take every single bit or piece of me that could possibly be used to save a life or to do research to save lives in the future, because for me, like, that's a legacy. That's something I'm really, doing in my life right now. I'm really advocating about using, what we have to do research to save, future lives. And if my body can do that.
Yeah, I mean, so I actually, at the end of the book, I go through some of my personal journey around that stuff, right? About trying to decide, because I'm death positive librarian and because I talk about how bodies were used, I get asked a lot about what happens to my dead body. And at first, when I first started getting asked, I was like, I don't know, I was like 28, wasn't really thinking about it. So I think that, over time, your ideas about what you want done with your dead body can change a lot also in terms of your life situation, where you are. So throughout that thing, I was like, I think I might want to donate my body to the medical school where I was working, and what would that entail? And so I went to the body donor appreciation ceremony and saw how respectful all the students were and the families were there and all that. And then I did that sort of at the beginning of my book research. And then at the end, I actually went to the anatomy lab and saw my first open corpses and, firsthand, and was with the students while they were learning. And I just felt a lot more, I felt a lot more resolve. It didn't creep me out. Although when I left the anatomy lab, it felt like I was walking back into some other world. Like, it was kind of, I don't know if it was the fumes or what, but I was just kind of like, I am different now than I was when and now I'm just supposed to go to lunch, that kind of feeling. And so I could kind of start to put myself in the mindset of what happens when you are becoming a doctor, like all the mental and psychological changes that are occurring when you're trying to do that. And I think that's also why, in general, I haven't gotten thus far any negative feedback from doctors about the book, because it is not like doctors are bad and terrible and you should hate them for all these things that you do. I think, ultimately I make an argument that if you want humane healthcare, which I think we all do, that is very important to attend to the psychological and physical needs of people who are learning to be doctors, that this is a huge psychological transition. They need to be helped along in that transition. And if they can't provide this kind of care that we want, if we don't give that to them, I think that's incredibly important. And so it's like, yeah, I went through this whole process of, going through these different ideas and kind of coming and signing paperwork and all that stuff. And then I say in the book, life changes could affect this. What if I change jobs? Well, guess what? I changed jobs. And now I'm like, well, it's like, I don't really, I think do I want to move to a different hospital? Do I want to do something different? Because now all these new things are coming up. Recomposition is really awesome. It's like green burial, but it's in an urban environment. It's like really wonderful kind of thing. And aquamation's pretty cool too, and also a lot more ecologically friendly. There's just new things under the sun. Absolutely. All the time.
I have an aquamation clause in my will. I actually put that in because it's not legal in Pennsylvania yet for humans. It is for animals. And so I put a clause in my will that specifically states if aquamation becomes legal before I die, that's how I want my body, whatever's left. Because again,
Yes.
hopefully not going to be too much left. I want to be as little as a burden on the earth as possible. And I'm really betting Tibetan sky burials are not going to make a comeback, you know, or not going to arrive in Philadelphia, the greater Philadelphia area. So aquamation, I feel like, is a nice lower impact.
A lot lower, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, in
It
terms of,
uses as much water as a bath would use. And yeah, it's really, it's, you know, you don't get the carbon emissions, whatever. It's a lot better. And
there
yeah,
was
when
some
people hear
pullback.
that, you know, so for
Yeah,
instance, a lot of people who are from a Jewish background would be very opposed psychologically to being cremated, very understandably. But if it's water, maybe that is more appealing, you know? So it's like,
yeah,
it's all about, again, like, we're getting more options, we're getting more choice, and that's good. And that we should be engaging with our mortality and thinking about these, like, what do we really want to do? Yeah, do I want to advance learning because that's something I did in my life, you know? Now that I know so much about the way the bodies were sourced, you know, through history, the idea of consenting to that is, and helping with that willingly, is very appealing, right?
yeah.
And so, or like, yeah, if my tattoo ends up in the museum, it's like I ended up there because I wanted to be at the Mùtter forever. And that is very different than how a lot of the other people who ended up there. But to me, that's like a beautiful example of progress.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're moving from the 19th century into the 20th and 21st, and our practices are reflective of our cult of what's, you know, of cultural trends and all of this. And but more, I think, to me, from a curatorial standpoint too, I'm so excited to get the stories of the patients. You know, that's that level, that extra level of interpretation, that extra added to the story, to be able to have the juxtaposition of the medical and the personal, is so interesting and so educational. And I think that's kind of what bring it back to Mary being very unique. The books, because it has so much of her um, information about it. I think that's what draws me to that story so much. And I just say thank you so much for not only agreeing to do this video, but thank you for writing this book that is just fascinating, and I love it. And I can't wait to spread the word about it. And I hope everybody who watches this video will have links in the comments of places where you can buy it as well. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. And, you know, thanks to the College of Physicians of Philadelphia and the Mùtter Museum for welcoming me to your door and in your back rooms over and over and over again. I just kept coming back and you didn't turn me away once, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that.
Thank you. And once this pandemic is over, let's make a date to come back and have you visit again.
I'll be there.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care. Be safe too. Bye.